I never thought I'd become the neighborhood's most wanted criminal for having the wrong shade of beige on my mailbox. Yet here I was, standing in my driveway on a perfect Saturday morning, holding what appeared to be my 15th HOA violation notice in 3 months. My crime this time? Apparently my garden gnome, a gift from my late mother, was an unauthorized lawn ornament that severely disrupted the aesthetic harmony of Willow Creek Estates. I couldn't help but chuckle as I read the notice, complete with a threat of a $500 fine if not removed within 48 hours. Welcome to suburban warfare, where the weapons are passive-aggressive notes and the general leading the charge was none other than Deborah Wilson, our HOA board president, though everyone in the neighborhood just called her Violation Debbie behind her back. I'm Michael Reynolds, a 37-year-old software engineer who works from home. I bought my house in Willow Creek Estates 2 years ago, attracted by the well-maintained common areas and the promise of a peaceful community. The first 6 months were blissful. I renovated my home office, planted a small garden in the backyard, and even joined the neighborhood running group. Then everything changed when Deborah Wilson was elected as the HOA board president. A woman in her mid-50s with a perfectly maintained blonde bob and a perpetual look of disappointment, Deborah approached her role with the intensity of a field marshal planning an invasion. Within weeks, violation notices began appearing on doors throughout the neighborhood for infractions so minor they bordered on the absurd. My first notice arrived after I installed solar-powered garden lights along my front walkway. According to Deborah, they weren't on the approved lighting fixtures list, despite being virtually identical to the ones 3 other houses on my street had. I attended the next HOA meeting to clarify the rules, only to find that Deborah had an uncanny ability to talk in circles until everyone was too confused or exhausted to argue. She would quote bylaws that seemed to shift depending on who was asking the question. I complied and removed the lights, chalking it up to the price of community living. The second notice came when my grass apparently grew a 1/4 inch beyond regulation height while I was away on a business trip for 4 days. The third was for leaving my recycling bin visible from the street for an extra 3 hours after collection. By the 6th notice, for having a bird feeder that allegedly attracted nuisance wildlife, I began to suspect something wasn't right. My neighbors weren't receiving nearly as many violations, and some who committed the same infractions received no notices at all. It was my neighbor Alina who first suggested that Deborah might have it out for me. "You know," she said over the fence one evening as I was removing the bird feeder, "I have the exact same feeder in my backyard, and I've never got a notice." Alina, a retired school teacher with a keen eye for neighborhood politics, had lived in Willow Creek for over a decade. I think it started at the spring barbecue. You corrected her when she was telling everyone that story about property values dropping because of unapproved paint colors. I vaguely remembered the conversation. Deborah had been spouting some questionable statistics, and with my background in data analysis, I gently pointed out that her numbers didn't add up. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but looking back, I did recall how her smile had frozen before she excused herself to refill her wine glass. Apparently, Deborah Wilson was not someone who appreciated being publicly corrected, especially by the newcomer. The notices continued to arrive with alarming regularity. My trash cans were too visible from the street. My holiday decorations exceeded the permitted time frame by 2 days. The shade of beige I used to touch up my mailbox was desert tan instead of the approved Sahara sand. Each violation came with increasingly hefty fines, all authorized by Deborah in her capacity as board president. I paid the first few, thinking it easier than fighting, but the amounts soon became ridiculous. Then came the turning point. Returning home from grocery shopping one afternoon, I found Deborah herself standing on my front lawn, phone in hand, photographing my house. When I asked what she was doing, she smoothed her immaculate bob and replied with practiced sweetness, "Just documenting the continued violations for board records, Michael. Your front door wreath exceeds the maximum diameter by at least 2 inches. That's outlined clearly in Section 7.3 of the Covenant." She tilted her head in a way that was probably meant to appear sympathetic but came across as condescending. "Perhaps if maintaining community standards is too challenging, Willow Creek isn't the right fit for you." Something in her tone, the barely concealed satisfaction, made something click in my mind. I decided it was time to stop being reactive and start being strategic. That night, I pulled out every violation notice I'd received and spread them across my dining table. I created a spreadsheet documenting each alleged infraction, the cited bylaw, date, and fine amount. Then I did something Deborah probably never expected. I actually read the entire HOA covenant, all 73 mind-numbing pages of it. What I discovered was interesting indeed. Many of the violations I'd been cited for either didn't exist in the actual bylaws, were being misinterpreted, or applied standards that weren't officially adopted by the HOA. For instance, there was no specific approved color list for mailboxes, just a requirement that they be maintained in good condition and be a neutral earth tone. The garden gnome prohibition? Nowhere to be found in the actual rules. The next day I took a walk around the neighborhood with my phone, discreetly photographing dozens of similar violations that had gone uncited on other properties, including, ironically, a collection of garden gnomes on Deborah's next-door neighbor's lawn. My next step was to attend an HOA board meeting. I sat quietly in the back, observing the dynamics. The board consisted of 5 members, but it was clear that Deborah dominated the proceedings. The other members, a retired couple who wintered in Florida, a busy surgeon who rarely spoke, and a young mother who seemed perpetually overwhelmed, largely deferred to Deborah's judgment. When it came time for resident comments, I politely asked to see the official record of violations issued over the past year. Deborah's smile tightened. "Those records are only available to board members for privacy reasons," she replied smoothly. "Actually," I countered, having done my homework, "according to state law and our own bylaws, violation records, with personal identifying information redacted, must be made available to any homeowner upon request." The young mother on the board looked surprised, while the surgeon suddenly seemed more interested in the proceedings. Deborah quickly moved to the next agenda item, but I had made my point and put her on notice. The following week, after submitting my request in writing, I received a heavily redacted document that was practically useless. It was time to escalate. I contacted my cousin Rachel, a real estate attorney who specialized in property law and homeowners associations. After reviewing my documentation, she confirmed my suspicions. "Mike, based on what you've shown me, these violations are largely unenforceable. Some don't exist in your covenant, others are being selectively enforced, which is illegal, and the approval process for some of these rules doesn't appear to have followed proper procedure." Rachel helped me draft a formal letter to the entire board, not just Deborah, outlining the issues and requesting that all outstanding fines be dismissed. I also requested a proper audit of the violation notice process. The letter was professional but firm, citing relevant state laws and HOA regulations. I hand-delivered copies to each board member's home, including Deborah's. 2 days later, I received a terse email from Deborah stating that my concerns would be addressed at the next board meeting in 3 weeks. In the meantime, a new violation notice appeared on my door for unauthorized communication with board members outside official channels, an infraction that, unsurprisingly, didn't exist in any bylaw. The day before the board meeting, something unexpected happened. The young mother from the board, Jessica, knocked on my door. Looking nervously over her shoulder, she spoke in a hushed tone. "I shouldn't be here, but after your letter, I started looking into things. Deborah keeps all the violation records on her personal laptop, not in the HOA office like she's supposed to, and I've never actually seen a formal vote on half these rules she's enforcing." She hesitated, then added, "There are others who've had similar experiences to yours, but most people just pay the fines to avoid conflict. Deborah can make life really difficult for people who cross her." I thanked Jessica for her courage and assured her I would be discreet. Her inside information confirmed what I had begun to suspect. Deborah was essentially running a fiefdom, using the HOA as her personal enforcement mechanism against anyone who displeased her. At the board meeting the next evening, the room was unusually full. Word had gotten around, and many homeowners were curious about the confrontation brewing between Deborah and the guy with too many garden gnomes. When my case came up on the agenda, Deborah tried to summarize it dismissively. Mr. Reynolds has expressed some confusion about our community standards and enforcement procedures. I've reviewed his concerns and found them to be without merit. I move that we reaffirm all violations and associated fines." Before anyone could second her motion, I stood up and calmly laid out my case, complete with a handout showing side-by-law comparisons of actual bylaw text versus the violations I'd received. I concluded by saying, "I'm not asking for special treatment, just for fair and consistent application of our actual rules. I believe an independent audit of our violation process and a review of the board's rulemaking procedure would benefit everyone in Willow Creek." The room was silent for a moment before erupting in murmurs of agreement. Several neighbors stood to share similar experiences, including Elena, who pointedly mentioned her identical but never cited bird feeder. Deborah's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "I have worked tirelessly to maintain property values in this community while the rest of you complain about following simple rules." The surgeon, Dr. Patel, who had been quietly reviewing my documentation, finally spoke up. "I think Mr. Reynolds raises valid concerns. Perhaps we should conduct an internal review before proceeding with these fines." The retired couple nodded in agreement, while Jessica stared intently at her notepad, avoiding Deborah's glare. Cornered, Deborah attempted a strategic retreat. "Fine, we'll review the process. All pending violations will be held in abeyance until next month's meeting." She quickly adjourned the meeting before further discussion could take place. As people filed out, several neighbors approached to thank me for speaking up. "She's been pulling this stuff for years," one elderly gentleman confided. "About time someone called her out." I should have known Deborah wouldn't surrender her power so easily. The next morning I woke to find not one but 3 new violation notices on my door, each citing increasingly obscure bylaws with substantial fines totaling over $2,000. The message was clear: cross me, and I'll make you pay. What Deborah didn't realize was that she had just handed me exactly what I needed. Rachel reviewed the new violations and smiled grimly. "This is textbook harassment and selective enforcement. With this pattern clearly established, we have grounds for legal action." She helped me prepare a civil complaint against both Deborah personally and the HOA board for selective enforcement, harassment, breach of fiduciary duty, and violation of state HOA regulations. Rather than filing immediately, however, Rachel suggested one more attempt at resolution. We sent a formal legal letter outlining the claim and offering to settle if all fines were dismissed, Deborah resigned from the board, and the HOA adopted transparent enforcement procedures with proper checks and balances. The letter went to all board members and included a deadline of 10 days for response. Predictably, Deborah ignored it. Less predictably, Dr. Patel called me directly. "Mr. Reynolds, I've reviewed your attorney's letter and your documentation. I had no idea things had gotten this out of hand." He sounded genuinely concerned. "The board is divided. The Johnsons, the retired couple, support Deborah out of habit. Jessica and I have concerns but have been outvoted consistently. Would you be willing to meet informally to discuss a resolution?" The meeting took place at Dr. Patel's home, with Jessica also present. They confirmed much of what I had suspected. Deborah had gradually consolidated power using her forceful personality and meticulous knowledge of procedural rules to dominate board decisions. Many violations were issued without full board approval, and the filing system was, as Jessica had mentioned, kept solely on Deborah's personal computer rather than in official records. "The problem," Dr. Patel explained, "is that without access to those records, we can't prove any of this." He looked uncomfortable. "And frankly, many of us fear the disruption a lawsuit would cause in the community." I understood their predicament but couldn't back down now. "I appreciate your candor," I told them, "but these practices have to stop. If the board won't act, I'll have no choice but to proceed legally." 3 days later, having received no official response from Deborah or the board, Rachel filed our complaint in county court. The same day, I sent an email to all Willow Creek residents' addresses obtained from the neighborhood directory, briefly explaining the situation and why I had felt compelled to take legal action. I was careful to keep the tone factual and non-elemental, focusing on the principle of fair treatment rather than personal attacks on Deborah. I included copies of some of the more ridiculous violations I'd received, alongside the actual bylaw text. The community response was immediate and divided. Some neighbors applauded me for standing up to what one email called the HOA tyrant. Others criticized me for causing drama and potentially costing everyone money if the HOA had to pay legal fees. A few suggested I should have just complied with the rules, apparently missing the point that many of these rules didn't actually exist. Deborah herself remained publicly silent, though she made a point of ostentatiously photographing my house whenever she walked past. The legal process moved slowly, as these things do. During discovery, our biggest break came when the court ordered the HOA to produce all violation records for the past 3 years. When Deborah claimed they were accidentally deleted during a computer upgrade, the judge was not amused. He ordered a forensic examination of the HOA's digital records, including Deborah's personal laptop used for official business. The forensic examination revealed a goldmine of evidence. Deborah had kept meticulous records, seemingly unaware that deleted files could be recovered. The data showed a clear pattern of selective enforcement, with certain residents, primarily those who had disagreed with Deborah at meetings or socially, receiving disproportionate numbers of violations. Even more damning, we discovered emails between Deborah and her friend who served as the HOA's property manager, discussing which residents to target and how to justify the violations. In one particularly incriminating exchange, Deborah wrote about me specifically. "Need to find more violations for the smart aleck in 217. Maybe he'll get the message and move." As this evidence came to light, the HOA's attorney, hired by their insurance company, pushed hard for settlement. The other board members, now fully aware of Deborah's actions, were horrified by the potential liability she had created. In a closed emergency board meeting from which Deborah was asked to recuse herself, they voted to settle the case on terms highly favorable to me. All fines dismissed with full refunds for those I'd already paid, a formal apology, and, most significantly, a complete restructuring of the violation process, requiring documentation, multiple board member approval, and regular audits. The settlement also included a confidential financial payment to cover my legal fees and additional damages, which I can't disclose the exact amount of, but let's just say it covered a very nice vacation and some home improvements. The one sticking point was my insistence that Deborah resign from the board entirely, a condition she fought bitterly until the HOA's attorney bluntly informed her that the alternative was the association pursuing its own action against her personally for breach of fiduciary duty. 2 days before we were set to finalize the settlement, Deborah made one last desperate play. She called an emergency HOA meeting without informing me, apparently hoping to rally community support. Unfortunately for her, by this point most residents had seen the evidence included in court filings which had become public record. Rather than finding support, she faced a room full of angry neighbors, many of whom had reviewed their own violation histories and recognized the pattern of abuse. The meeting, by all accounts, was chaotic. Elena later told me that several residents stood up to share their experiences with unfair violations. The final blow came when the HOA's accountant, pressured by questions from increasingly suspicious homeowners, reluctantly admitted that violation fine money, which should have gone into the general HOA fund, had been used to pay for board education and development, that coincidentally included a weekend leadership retreat at a luxury resort attended only by Deborah and her property manager friend. Deborah resigned the next morning, citing health concerns and the toxic atmosphere created by certain residents. The settlement was finalized the following week and a special election was held to fill the vacant board positions. In a development that still makes me smile, Elena was elected as the new president, with Dr. Patel as vice president. Together with Jessica and 2 other new members, they implemented the transparency measures required by the settlement and added a few of their own. As for Deborah, she put her house on the market 3 weeks later. At the open house, the real estate agent could be overheard explaining to potential buyers that the seller was downsizing to a condo with no HOA. Elena couldn't resist placing her garden gnome collection, mysteriously grown to include one that bore a striking resemblance to a certain former board president, in her front yard facing directly toward Deborah's for sale sign. The epilogue to this suburban drama came 6 months later at the annual HOA summer picnic. The event had previously been a tense affair presided over by Deborah, with residents nervously checking that their children didn't break any of the myriad unwritten rules. This year, under Elena's leadership, the atmosphere was relaxed and genuinely neighborly. As I helped set up the grills, numerous residents approached to thank me for taking a stand. My wife and I were actually considering moving before all this happened, Dr. Patel confided as we flipped burgers. Deborah cited us 8 times in 1 month for our son's basketball hoop, claiming it violated some architectural guidelines she could never quite specify. Now my son shoots hoops with half the neighborhood kids after school. The most satisfying moment came when Jessica presented me with a special community award, a framed copy of the newly adopted Homeowners Bill of Rights that the board had implemented, guaranteeing fair treatment and transparent processes for all residents. At the bottom was a small golden plaque reading, "The Reynolds Rule, no enforcement without representation." It now hangs proudly in my home office, right next to my mother's garden gnome, which stands unmolested on my front lawn to this day. I learned a lot from my battle with Deborah and the HOA. I learned that sometimes standing up for principle is worth the discomfort of conflict. I learned that systems only work when there's transparency and accountability. Most importantly, I learned that communities thrive when rules exist to serve the common good, not to enable petty tyranny. Our neighborhood is a happier, more cohesive place now, with property values still intact despite Deborah's dire predictions of anarchy if her iron rule ended. Sometimes I think about Deborah in her HOA-free condo, hopefully reflecting on the lessons of her downfall, but mostly, I enjoy the simple pleasure of walking through my neighborhood, waving to neighbors who are no longer afraid to put up a bird feeder or paint their mailbox the wrong shade of beige. And if you visit Willow Creek Estates today, you'll notice something unusual: an extraordinary number of garden gnomes peeking out from behind flowers and shrubs throughout the community. Small, whimsical symbols of freedom from petty tyranny, each one a tiny monument to the power of standing up to a bully armed with fake violation notices and a clipboard.